Well, thank you, Evan, for coming to my talk. I confess that at the University of Kansas, I've done my fair share of ghost stalking between spending time in California and being in my on the job market. But I'm really grateful to share some of my favorite ideas that I've immersed myself in some of the past few years with everyone on the department. And so I usually use this image to kind of set the mood for this talk because my core focus of my research is to really understand ecosystem change across regional scales. And the coolest parts of that is bridging the processes that we field ecologists study within local communities with the regional environmental and human impacts. And of course, human impacts on ecosystems are ramping up gradually but profoundly. This includes impacts on a local scale that can be pretty intense, like fisheries, larger scales like pollution, and of course, on a global scale with climate change. These are things that we have, unlike fisheries, we have very little control over. These are long-term changes that we're locked into now for many decades to come. And kind of one of the greatest concerns in conservation is that sometimes these gradual changes in environment can trigger a sudden collapse of species and ecosystems. So this includes the overgrazing of pristine grasslands, lakes turning green from pollution, and the loss of lush kelp forests turning into urchin barrens. Oftentimes, these changes in ecosystems represent one of these states represent degraded ecosystem states. So, for example, in an urchin barren, we'll lose about 100 species associated with kelp. So, one kind of very distinct signal here is just how different the states of these ecosystems are. And the other thing that's kind of really distinct is how quickly these transitions can happen, what we call regime shifts. Okay, so grasslands can become overgrazed in a matter of years, lakes turn green within a matter of weeks. And in 2014, we saw all of the North California coast turn into an urchin barren. And this is something that we've seen now hundreds and hundreds of times across ecosystems. Now, the fact that these kind of large and persistent and really rapid changes in ecosystems can happen. First of all, it's very convenient because it's something that's very bizarre, and not a few things can only a few things can cause bizarre, right? So there's some cues that there's some underlying key mechanisms and feedbacks that structure a lot of these ecosystems. But thinking very broadly, what these kinds of dynamics have told ecologists many, many decades ago is that this idea that ecosystems always recover to some single natural steady state is really incomplete, okay? Nature can change irreversibly from our actions, and that a lot of the time, perhaps ecosystems exhibit multiple steady states. Okay, for instance, in a kelp forest, if we have a small disturbance, we have this key feedback loop that helps us recover. As we get an increase in plants that reduce their herbivory level per plant that each plant experiences, and that leads to even more kelp. But if we have a bigger disturbance that exceeds the ecological resilience of kelp forests, we cross a tipping point. And now the tables turn. Less kelp means even more herbivory, means even less kelp. Now, so one of the key insights here is that regime shifts happen when we have alternative stable states, and they happen specifically if a disturbance pushes us past the tipping point. But another way regime shifts can happen is if we have some long-term change that brings the ecosystem closer to the tipping point. Okay, and now even a small disturbance can push us over the edge. So we have to think about where the tipping points are, as well as what kind of shocks the system experiences. Now, I'm going to be talking to you today about alternative stable states just in ecosystems, but I want to briefly point out this is a phenomenon prevalent all across biology, whether we're talking about gene expression and molecular switches, synchronization of neurons, speciation, or developmental patterns. So some of this stuff is going to be, a lot of the mathematical techniques are going to be very applicable in understanding those systems as well. Now, with regime shifts in ecosystems, regime shifts between alternative stable states, it's critical to recognize that they only happen over a limited range of conditions, outside of which we either have only one state stable or only the other state stable. And we usually kind of track this with this S-curve diagram. Now, our key goal here is to try to stay outside the conditions. And so in terms of our impacts on the ecosystem, whether that's pollution intensity or fishing intensity, we want to stay outside the conditions where we risk regime shifts and ecosystem collapse. Okay, we want to find a safe operating space, both for now and in future climates. Okay. The key challenge here, though, is that we really don't want to learn by doing here. Okay, we really don't want to discover that there's an urchin barren or a collapsed ecosystem state after we've already crossed the tipping point. We want to be able to foresee tipping points. For this, we really, in conditions that we haven't experienced before. And this requires us to use really process-based models to make these predictions. Now, the big challenge here is up until a few years ago, our best process-based models have only been able to explain ecosystem dynamics in relatively simple systems like experimental mesocosms or shallow lakes. And so the key conservation challenges that we're faced with is how do we understand the presence of tipping points and resilience at really large spatial scales, like in large ecosystems or complex landscapes? Second of all, how do we do this quickly in many ecosystems where we don't have very good data on? And then how do we implement our conservation solutions in time? So this all drives one big avenue of my work, which is all about scaling up, expanding classical ecological theory to greater levels of biological complexity. And this is always really fun because you put together this complex looking model and then you get to ask, are our classical theories, the simple theories that we get out of simple models, do they still work in this complicated system? Okay, and often they do, and that's pretty exciting. Or the alternative is that, no, maybe we see some kind of completely new behavior emerge, and that's also very exciting. So I really love doing this, but I'm not going to talk about that today at all. But I do want to point out that this informs the second big avenue of my work, which is to combine theory with large-scale field data. Okay, and the key kind of exciting question there is less about kind of biological complexity that we can control per se that we know about in a model, but more about how much do local processes that we study in local communities shape large ecosystems. Okay, how important are they in reality? And so on this avenue, I've gotten to work on some really cool questions about population conservation, invasive species and epidemics, in addition to my core work on ecological resilience. So today I'm going to focus on how we can understand ecological resilience in the context of global change. Okay, so we're going to be talking about how we can detect tipping points in present and future climates, how we can help anticipate large-scale collapses in understudied systems with a little bit of AI, and talk about fisheries. And then we're going to turn to, once we know about ecological solutions, how do we actually implement them in conservation? Okay, and in particular in social ecological systems where changes in ecosystems and changes in societies become intertwined with one another. So for this first part, I'm going to introduce you to one of my favorite systems, and it's been kind of my a big focus for my research, which is kelp forests. Okay, one reason I really love them is because they're very sensitive to environment and they're very, very dynamic. They grow rapidly. Okay, so they're great sentinels of environmental change, and they also occur all across the world's oceans. Now, in many of the places where we've studied kelp forests, we see them transitioning back and forth between two stable states. Okay, one state is the slush kelp forest where you have lots of habitat for other species, you have lots of food for hundreds of species, lots of very species-rich ecosystem state. The other state that you often find is one where you have these just barren expanses, no kelp at all. They're just filled with these spiny sea urchins, which are the herbivores in the system. And when you have a lot of urchins like that, they eat all the kelp, and then they shut down reproduction, and they're cold-blooded, so they don't have any energy expenditures. And then they just sit there on very little food for decades. And so we first have this never-ending urchin barren with herbivores that apparently don't need to eat. Yeah, invertebrates are awesome. But we have this issue where as soon as a kelp seedling tries to establish, it immediately gets munched down. So for a big part of my PhD, I really worked on understanding what processes actually lock these ecosystems into kelp forests or urchin barrens. And so the key feedback that's going on that I found is one that involves dynamic herbivore behavior. So in a lush kelp forest, you have this big kelp canopy, and you have bits of kelp tearing off and drifting down to the bottom. At the bottom is where the urchins sit, and they'd much prefer to sit in their habitats, sheltered from waves and predators, and get food delivered to them. Thank you very much. Okay. In this case, they're eating the leaves of kelp, but kind of indirectly. They're not eating the plants themselves. Okay, just the detritus that falls to them. When kelp canopies decline, though, and urchins get less and less of this food subsidy, they actually start going out of their hiding holes and trying to eat kelp directly. The only thing they can really eat is the stalks of these giant plants, and so very quickly they mow down the entire kelp forest within a matter of weeks. Okay, so we have this key feedback loop that involves dynamic urchin behavior that creates and stabilizes these two stable states. And in my PhD, I showed that this is how the system seems to work, and this is what creates patterning and stabilizes and creates alternative stable states in kelp forests. But going a little bit deeper, if we look at if we follow a single site, a single kelp reef over time, we see that it transitions back and forth between a kelp forest and an urchin barren state. Okay, so what on earth is causing this? Okay, we have persistent forests and we have persistent barrens and seemingly random switches between. And I kind of immediately, you might think of these cataclysmic events like big disturbances, like a storm ripping out a kelp forest, or an epidemic wiping out a lot of urchins. And one thing that certainly for me seemed much less likely is climate change. Okay, yes, we know that warm periods reduce nutrient supply to kelp from deep waters, but this we know tends to have a pretty weak effect on whether or not kelp are present. Okay, it's a pretty weak effect if we look collectively at the whole region. If we look at, if you're studying any individual site in this region, you won't even pick up this relationship as significant. And this, always made sense to me because we have these strong top-down and bottom-up interactions. How can climate have much of an impact at all? But we decided to delve into this a little bit deeper and more carefully. And our jumping off point, and I should say this was together with an excellent advisor at KU, Dan Ruman, and a really wonderful kelp working group of marine ecologists and oceanographers. And so our kind of starting off point was the same model I used in my PhD. And this is, I want to show this because it's, I think it very beautifully captures you'll see there's not a lot of processes here, but they capture an awful lot of the dynamics that we see in kelp forests all across the world. Which is, in short, basically the beauty of mathematics and the reason I do all of this. So we're tracking how kelp cover on a reef changes over time, dn over dt. Okay, that's going to depend on how many kelp there are, the recruitment conditions. In other words, how good was the year for kelp canopy growth, and how good was the year for, of course, new seedlings to establish as well. Okay, and that's going to depend on environment and potentially things like climate. Then we have competition, big plants shading out little plants, and urchins eating both seedlings and established kelp. Now, the functional form of this grazing function, okay, looks like this. It's a type 4 response. So if this parameter b is 0, then the model says the more kelp there are, the more kelp get eaten. And throughout we have a constant urchin density, and that's a very good assumption for the system. But if B is big, then the model says when we don't have a lot of kelp, we have a lot of kelp getting eaten and urchins grazing actively. And if we have a lot of kelp, urchins are hiding, and there's not a lot of kelp getting eaten. Okay, so this is the core model. It explains very well the very different spatial patterning that we see in kelp forests across the world. And so I think this is really the right way of looking at kelp forests on many, many questions. And so now we're kind of essentially, in short, our question is how, if environment affects kelp population growth, what are the consequences for tipping points in the system? That is all well and good, except we have no clue about how environment affects kelp population growth overall, and especially climate. We have some experiments and observation data spanning a couple of months at one or two sites, but nothing even close to, multi-year or robust at all. And so feel free to tune out for the slide if you're not an ecologist, but here's how we answer this conundrum. So we're going to be focusing for this talk on data from the Santa Barbara Channel, where we have about 80 long-term monitoring sites spanning 40 years. And this is where we have data on urchin densities, as well as kelp cover from satellites and ocean environment. And we're going to fit the model in two steps. The first one is kind of clever. We're going to look over time at every site, and we're going to calculate the population growth rate just from the time series, okay? And we're going to say that that population growth rate is how much kelp we have now relative to last year and how far away we were from carrying capacity last year, okay? This is just a logistic model rearranged for R. So that's going to be our response. Our predictors are going to be ocean climate and ocean environment. And we're going to stick those predict growth from ocean climate in a generalized additive model. So it's a spline, a fancy polynomial, and we're going to have that model predict population growth rate after we fit it, predict population growth rate for every site and every year. Okay. Now, the key here is that these predictions also represent the impact of climate on population growth. So we're not really using this GAM to predict anything. We're using it as a filter to isolate the role of climate on population growth. Okay, so after we have these model predictions, we're going to plug them into our dynamical model as a covariate, that environment-dependent population growth. We're also going to give it urchin density at the site and fit the 7 parameters of this dynamical. So what does this model tell us after we fit it? Well, as we expect, urchin density is very important. At a given temperature, as we have more and more urchins, gradually we lose the kelp forest state, and the ball always rolls into this urchin barren regime. Okay, we've known this. But now we can ask, if we hold the density of urchins constant, what is the effect of temperature? And we see at cool temperatures, the kelp forests are very resilient. There's a very deep well for that kelp forest state. But as things warm up, the tipping points shift to the degree that a small bump in the road is enough to trigger a collapse of the kelp forest state. Okay, so what this theory is telling us here, then the whole point of doing this, is that yes, we have these strong top-down and bottom-up interactions in the system, but they're very delicately balanced. In warmer climates, tip the scales in favor of kelp, in favor of urchin barrens. So this is what happens at an individual reef. What happens across the whole region is what you see here. So the dots are the proportion of about 1,000 reefs in the Santa Barbara Channel that are in an urchin barren state. Okay, the colors along the axis are the rough temperature of the water in that year. Okay, so we see very, very big fluctuations in how many urchin barrens we see across the region, and this dynamic is very well captured by our best fitting model. Now, if you remember, one of our assumptions in the model is that when we have low levels of kelp, we're in an urchin barren, we have a lot of active grazing urchins. That's when we should see a lot of exposed urchins as well. And this is exactly what we find in diver surveys. Now, okay, so that's what's been going on in the past. How can we use this model to chart a path to where we can maintain kelp forests in future climates? So if we do nothing, projected warming is looks like it's likely to turn most of the region into an urchin barren. But now we can also ask how regional climate and local urchin density together shape kelp forest resilience. Okay, so the x-axis is temperature, the global driver we can't do much about, the y-axis is urchin density on a reef. This is something that we might be able to regulate. So I'm going to be plotting in color the resilience of the kelp forest state, and here's what it looks like. This is the projected level of warming we expect in the system, but we can ask, if these changes occur, what can we do to maintain our current level of resilience? And we see that we can do that if we reduce urchin density by about half. And this is exactly what happens when we put in a marine protected area. where we're preventing fishing out of urchin predators. So we're increasing urchin predator densities. And I do want to point out, importantly, these gray dots here are observations, so we're pretty confident in what this looks like. Now, you might say Santa Barbara Channel is big, but it's still a small portion of the West Coast. Now, very luckily with satellite data, we can now kind of scale up and look at the geography of kelp forest resilience. So as we scan along the coast from north to south, we can plot for all the places where we find kelp, all those little habitat patches, we can plot what proportion of the time across the last 40 years was each patch in a kelp forest state. Okay, and those blue dots here, there's this giant cloud, there's like 500,000 of these patches. Okay, the key takeaway here is that in Southern California is where most of the reefs are spent about half the time in a kelp forest state and half the time in an urchin barren state. So they're really shifting back and forth, and that is one measure of resilience. We also, in Southern and Baja California, is where we see forests becoming less persistent and less expansive compared to urchin barrens. So by all these three metrics of resilience, we see urchin barrens and kelp forests, these flops back and forth between these ecosystem states as ocean climate changes. So this is a very large scale phenomenon. Okay, so what we see from all this is that subtle levels of climate change can collapse ecosystems by shifting tipping points. One thing I want to emphasize here is that the reason we can see it in kelp forests is because ocean climate in California is doing this. Okay, and over time it's getting warmer, of course. If you have a different system which is very steady and we have just gradual warming, you won't see anything happen until you get to the critical temperature and everything collapses. Okay, and there's no future opportunity to recover. The other thing I want to, as from my background in theory, I can tell you right now is that parameter change, so any kind of long-term change, will move tipping points in any system that has alternative stable states. So this kind of shifting tipping points with gradual long-term climate change is going to be a very systemic phenomenon across different ecosystems. We've seen that these large-scale change we might be able to counteract it with local action, putting in marine protected areas. But this is going to be pretty hard because climate change is a regional phenomenon. So these changes, these kelp forest collapses, are spanning massive spatial scales. So the reason, so the sheer scale of ocean climate change is what really makes tipping points a big problem in California. Now, if we zoom out to thinking a little bit more broadly across systems, we know extreme environmental events are becoming more common. They're spanning larger and larger spatial scales, things like heat waves. Now, does that mean that we're also going to see more and more often large-scale population declines and maybe even population collapses? That question is a little bit rhetorical, but the key question is which species are at risk and which ecosystems are at risk. And so here I kind of want to turn to a little bit to the question of how we can scale up our understanding of resilience to understudied systems, ones where we only have maybe long-term monitoring data. Okay, that is good, but we don't really know maybe a lot of the processes and mechanisms the way we do with kelp forests. Now, in many ecosystems, we have extreme events getting bigger and more frequent, as we've seen, for instance, with this 2022 heat wave over on the East Coast. And one of the key concerns is that as disturbances hit many subpopulations all at once, and this happens more and more often, we might see population synchrony increasing. Okay, what this means is that population declines are co-occurring across many patches, and they're spanning larger and larger spatial scales. Okay, one of the key issues for resilience here is that with high synchrony and potentially with extreme events, that'll mean that we have periods of some years every now and then when populations are very sparse all across the landscape, and we have few subpopulations remaining to seed recovery. So one thing we can do is to test what's the risk of this happening is to ask whether large-scale environmental disturbances in the past have led to large-scale population declines. Okay. In particular, we can ask, do subpopulations that experience similar environmental change also go up and down together? And what we found historically is that they really don't. Synchrony in populations is often much less than synchrony in environment. Okay, what this signals is that across many, many systems, there's some kind of landscape resilience features that often in many systems prevent large-scale population synchrony. And so this was kind of this broad question was really the jumping off point for me in my NSF postdoc fellowship together with Dan Ruman, Steve Munch, and Tanya Rogers. Why is high synchrony in populations typically rare? And will this resilience continue in future climates? So as we start with a very simple kind of one possible idea of what might prevent synchrony, okay? And that is response diversity. Okay, if we have temperature, if we look at population response to temperature, maybe in one location, hot temperatures are very bad. So as temperature varies over time, that means warm temperatures, population declines. But maybe in another population that has access to a thermal refuge, warm temperatures aren't bad, or maybe even a little bit okay. And so it has a completely different response to the same changes in temperature. Okay, so that's one perfectly reasonable idea. It's likely that this happens, at least to some extent, almost everywhere. How do we measure this? Well, typically we'd go in and have to think about every potential interaction within the population, within the community, and all the possible ways that environment impacts things. Then for every interaction, we're going to have to pick or figure out what the functional form of that interaction is. You know, how does environment affect abundance? Okay, and this is already pretty hard and a lot of work. But now the core question is, how does response differ across locations? So we need to repeat this procedure for every place in a landscape. And this is something that's pretty much impossible to do. And I'm not sure of any system where we've been able to do this, certainly experimentally. Now, the kind of one method that I'm really excited for and as a potential savior here is EDM. And in this case, it's not electrodance music, it's empirical dynamic model. Okay, the idea here is we're going to detect causal interactions and account for unobserved processes by basically making a map of the dynamics from the time series themselves. Okay, for that we're using Dawkins theorem attractor reconstruction. Ask a physicist and they'll become very excited. Now, to figure out what these interactions actually look like, we're going to use a little bit of AI called Gaussian processes. This allows us to not have to write down a specific equation, not guess the equation ahead of time. We let the data tell us what the equation is. And it's also very careful about uncertainty. And we can also make these Gaussian processes, these function hierarchical across space. So we can quantify response, things like response diversity. Now, the data we're applying to is 36 species from the east and west coast. The maps show you sampling location to give you an idea of scale. Okay, and we pair this with data on environment, things like temperature, zooplankton, and ocean climate. One thing to point out here is that as we scan north to south in these ecosystems, there's very big gradients in the mean environment across locations. So very steep gradients in temperature, also big gradients in productivity across latitudes. And also what we see in these systems is that species are much less synchronized than changes in environment. Okay, so there is something going on in these systems like most of the other ecosystems studied before. Now, here's how the models, how EDM models perform. The data is in black, the model predictions are in blue. They do pretty well across species. On average, we explain across 36 species, we explain about half of the variation. And also the different rows here are dynamics of each species from different locations. So you can see that there's a lot of variability across landscapes. That's pretty apparent. Now, importantly, one of the things that the EDMs aspects of the data that the EDMs also capture is the low level of synchrony. Okay, so now let's look at what do the EDMs tell us, what are the mechanisms that actually prevent synchrony. And we can do this with by playing around with these models and simulating different experiments and climate change. So one thing that the models find is that there's, as we kind of guessed, there's quite a bit of response diversity, okay? Different populations respond differently to environment, depending on what location you're looking at. Okay, so here's the northern anchovy, for instance, with temperature. For this pink population, warm years are improve things. For this green population, warmer years are bad. Okay, and the same thing for El Nino. So there's really profound levels of variation across location. There's lots of response diversity. And we see that when we allow models to have response diversity, different lines for different populations, our R-squared of our models in the California current increases a lot, okay, compared to models where we make all populations follow the same response curve. In the Northeast Shelf, though, on the East Coast, the R-squared doesn't increase that much, okay? So there's not as much response diversity over on the East Coast. Instead, what our models tell us is happening on the East Coast is that subpopulations actually share the same thermal response curve, but experience different absolute temperatures. And this is because we have those gradients in the mean environment. Okay, for instance, for an extreme event like last year's the 2022 heat wave, we have to think not just about the scale of the anomaly, but also how absolute conditions that locations experience, okay? For instance, maybe we only exceed thermal thresholds of the southern areas of the system, okay? And to reiterate that, this is the scale of the anomaly, almost the same everywhere. This is the absolute temperature, very different in different locations, okay? And so accordingly, accounting for gradients in the California current isn't very important. It is very important in the Northeast Shelf. As you might expect, the species rely on different species rely on different environmental drivers. So, and the species that rely on drivers with stronger gradients are the ones that historically had less synchrony. Okay, that one's pretty intuitive. But one thing that's more interesting now is we can ask what happens with climate change. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to be simulating an increase in extreme events. So periods of high and low nutrients, high and low zooplankton, and periods of high temperature. Okay, so if we just simulate that, again, looking across for different species that span different magnitudes of gradients, and we look at how much does synchrony increase when we have extreme events. And the answer is here in these faint gray circles, and the answer is not much. Okay, species are pretty resilient to increases in extreme event frequency. But the really big kind of threat here is that is another impact of climate change, and that is that environmental gradients are eroding. Okay, on the East Coast, for example, we have northern latitudes warming faster than southern latitudes. And when we look at what happens when we combine more frequent extreme events and the loss of environmental gradients, we get this, okay? The populations that span big environmental gradients are the ones where we see the biggest increases in synchrony. And they are also the populations where we see the biggest declines in resilience. Okay, these values are the 10th quantile of regional density. So we have a big increase in the frequency of large-scale population declines. And it's particularly happening within the species that historically looked the most resilient, had the least synchrony. Okay, so the things that look to be most resilient right now might be the most vulnerable if we lose environmental gradients. Okay, so in future climates, increasing extremes might not be a big problem, but the loss of gradients might be. Okay, as you saw, there's a big spread along the x-axis in those last plots, so the impacts will vary across species, which means that if we're trying to anticipate climate change impacts, just predicting environment is not enough. We need to understand population processes. The other thing, kind of zooming out a little bit, that I really love about this is it highlights that synchrony is often low because population dynamics and responses to environment vary a lot across landscapes. Okay, now all the community ecologists in the room are kind of rolling their eyes. Of course, we know species composition differs across locations, microhabitats differ, etc. But this is the first time that as a community ecologist, basically the coolest part about this for me, I think, is that we highlight that these differences in local communities matter. They lead to response diversity, and that is what underpins landscape stability in these systems. This is what our study shows. So that's a very cool and pragmatic view. You can also look at it in a slightly different way, which is that with these kinds of EDM approaches, we can now do a litmus test in systems where we have monitoring data. Look at two communities and see if they have the same dynamics. If they do, there's no point in trying to figure out what the differences are between those communities, right? Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. So that's a little bit of a hotter take. But now I want to shift to how we actually implement conservation solutions. Okay, and how do we do this quickly? So once we need to know what we need to do so we back away from a potential tipping point and avert ecosystem disaster, it's kind of tempting to say, okay, so we're ecologists, we've figured out the solution. Here's what you need to do to keep things okay. And the problem with this view is that very often we don't really have a central agency that can dictate human actions, okay? We have fishing as the x-axis in our models, but this is not something that we can control very easily, or pollution, okay? In many emerging conservation problems, anthropogenic impact is controlled by many stakeholders. And this is what causes these more and more of these wicked environmental problems, where reducing impacts is a really lengthy process that requires concerted actions by many, many individuals and stakeholders. And the problem here, one of the really interesting problems is that getting lots of people on board takes time. And over those longer timescales, the services that ecosystems can provide can also change, and they become intertwined with social change. So for this, to kind of illustrate this, for this portion of the talk, I'm going to be focusing on harmful algae blooms in Western Lake Erie. In the late 60s, we had a lot of intense pollution in the system from a few coastal sources. We put in water treatment plants. We fixed the issue. It's one of the best, one of the big success stories in conservation. More recently, though, algae blooms are coming back in Lake Erie. And this is because climate change is exacerbating the remaining pollution that's coming from farms all across the watershed. Okay, so fixing this requires action from many, many people. And to look at how we might be able to achieve this, I put together a team of social and political scientists, a lot of really good colleagues. And we started by thinking broadly about changes in human societies when we have environmental degradation. Okay, we started a very broad literature review of different problems and how societies respond to them. And what we found is that societies can actually adapt to crappier and crappier ecosystems. And this happens through two common pathways. The first is that local economies can shift away from declining ecosystem services. Okay, if we have lots of anoxia, all the fish are dying, and you have a business renting out boats to recreational fishers, you're going to go out of business pretty quickly if no one comes and rents boats. Okay, and the same thing is going to happen with shoreline property values. Within fisheries, we see this kind of thing all the time as we're shifting target species. And this is a whole phenomenon we call fishing down the food web as we deplete top predators and we fish smaller and smaller fish. And it can also take more insidious forms, like we have the lake water is now polluted. Let's build a water treatment plant to clean water. This is fine, but now that we have clean water, why bother cleaning up the lake? So that's one thing that happens, is kind of a fundamental shift in economies that can be pretty quick. Another thing that happens is that public concern can respond very rapidly to key environmental issues, but it also can decline quite quickly within a matter of a few years. Okay, so public attention is very ephemeral, and it doesn't really matter what year you look at, what state, or whether even the problem was fixed or not. Okay, so now we want to help tell how social adaptation impacts this reliance on farmers to get on board in Western Lake Erie. And that conservation problem, we developed a data-driven model of social ecological resilience in the system. So this model incorporates an ecosystem service, water quality that's declining from high pollution. We also, in communities that experience frequent algae blooms, we see declines in recreational fisheries and property values. And as with many issues in Lake Erie, with many other conservation issues, in Lake Erie, we see already declining public concern for algae blooms, both historically and with the ongoing problem. And so we model this with kind of an epidemic type model. Critically, the reason we do this is that in this system, we also find that public attention, that counties where farmers are more aware of algae bloom issues are also the places where farmers do more voluntary projects to reduce pollution, okay, voluntary actions. And so both concern and reliance together influence stakeholder and farmer decisions, whether they're going to commit to reducing pollution, okay? Now, one thing that's critical here is taking action for farmers is costly, okay? Maybe that's because they have to reduce fertilizer use and they're afraid of lower crop yields. There's just fundamentally a cost to doing something extra and shifting your behavior. So it might be real, it might be part of it might be perceived. And the other key challenge is that in most systems, it takes time to recognize that there's an environmental problem, figure out what the right solution is, and agree who's all going to do it. Okay, so there's very often a time delay between when the pollution starts and when action starts. Okay, so let's look at one simulation of the system where stakeholders start to reduce pollution or think about even reducing pollution 5 years after intense pollution begins. Okay, at this point in time, the ecosystem service is low, but reliance is still pretty high. Okay, we don't have the service, but we're still expecting it to be there. And public attention is pretty high as well. So if we start mitigating at this point, we see that the ecosystem recovers. And now not only do we have high water quality, but we also have a lot of people on board with reducing pollution. Okay, so this is kind of a pristine social ecological state. By contrast, if stakeholders begin to think about reducing pollution only 10 years after intense pollution has begun, well, at this point, the ecosystem service is again low, but now reliance is low and so is public attention. They're kind of declining already. And so at this late phase, there's not enough net incentives for mitigators to take action. They started thinking about doing it, but not many people are talking about it. I mean, they're already used to the lake being polluted, so why bother going there? And so there's not enough incentives for mitigation commitments to spread. And the system becomes locked into this degraded social ecological state where it's all polluted, we're not expecting it to provide services, and we're not doing anything to reverse the pollution. So in this system, we see that where we end up depends on how quickly we begin mitigating. We see that there's alternative stable states, and which state we end up on depends on when stakeholders begin to take action. In other words, there's a limited time window for action because we have alternative stable social ecological states. Okay, and the way that they're happening in the system is because changes in ecosystems and in societies are becoming intertwined. Okay, so this is what's creating limited windows of opportunity for us to take action and for restoration efforts to succeed. If you're too late, it'll never get off the ground. It'll never work. Now there's kind of the next natural question of how can we buy time and extend these opportunity windows? And this is where it's another reason why it's very nice to do a model. We can do a sensitivity analysis. And what we find is that interventions in society can be as important as interventions in the environment. Okay, and by this I mean simple things like highlighting the value of ecosystem services. Think about spending a day on the lake or on the beach. Okay, even though some people will complain that, oh, it's not as clean as it was before. We need to kind of increase the perceived value of the ecosystem service. Another thing we can do is think about taxing alternatives. Okay, yes, let's build this water treatment plan, but let's maybe also have a framework where it's going to contribute some funds to reducing pollution in the first place, the core problem. And another thing that so it's important to increase dialogue. So social learning among stakeholders, create forums for people to share experiences. And what's also can be really important is to create monetary incentives to offset the costs of degradation for stakeholders, and particularly concentrate those resources early on in those early mitigation phases so we can boost the number of early adopters. Okay, so kind of fundamental kind of investment type ideas they're pretty straightforward. So putting everything together, we see maybe a little bit of a downer note that global change can overall promote ecosystem collapse. And here's some pathways that it can do it. First of all, warming climates can shift tipping points, as we've seen with large-scale kelp forest collapses in California. Fortunately, we can detect this happening if we use models that bridge processes and region-wide environmental data. We also see that large-scale population declines might be becoming more and more common as climate change erodes environmental gradients. Again, luckily, we can foresee this happening in systems where we have monitoring data with new AI tools. And it also opens up a lot of really cool questions in community ecology. And then finally, there's a risk that societies can adapt to degraded ecosystems. Okay, this makes early incentives and mitigation really, really critical for whether conservation succeeds or not. Okay, and this is the one thing I want to emphasize here is that it's easy to think that, oh yeah, people get used to this over their lifetime. They remember how good things were 20 years ago. No, we're talking about very, very quick changes. We're talking about economic changes and changes in public attention that can occur within a decade or even less time. Okay, so rapid action is very, very important. Now to kind of keep working on this, I have a little bit of good news that I've been very lucky to be able to set up a quantitative resilience lab at the University of Maryland in College Park. So a lot of my work is going to be continuing to bridge theory and data and understand resilience. So from the response diversity we saw in the second project, where does it come from? Why do populations in different places respond differently to environment? Okay, so delving into that. With the critical role of urchin behavior, zooming out, how do dynamic interactions shape the stability of food webs? Okay, we're starting to get some of that data, for instance, in the Chesapeake Bay. And then kind of more on the theoretical line, how does the presence of tipping points and regime shifts change when we have dynamic species interactions, like with the urchins again, and when we start to kind of put some of those slow processes back in, whether it's the decline of long-lived species or changes in society, or whether we have evolution of shorter-lived species. Now, I would really like to thank a lot of friends and colleagues and mentors that got me to where I am today. And I'd really like to thank you all for listening, and I'd love to take your questions. Thank you.